All right.
Wait. Do you want to wait like 30 seconds before you start speaking? Because you don't know who's on.
Of course, no, we're not going to speak yet. We are live.
How
So
long
everybody
until I start?
knows. We got to give it a couple of minutes to see if everybody joins.
Hi,
Sadly, I
Janet.
cannot see. We're up to 6.
Good morning, Janet. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
That's the number. Yeah. All right, we're just waiting for everyone to join us. So talk amongst yourselves, even though only we can.
You know, you hate it. Nobody laughs. You don't know what's going on. You think people think you're funny. You don't know.
You're funny.
You'll get some text messages.
I know you're funny.
Feel free to text Richard for some feedback.
I can't see a damn thing without my
Yeah,
glasses.
neither can I.
You have your glasses on.
I still can't see. All right, people are joining, so I don't want to start yet.
Okay.
So we have to give it a minute. Still joining.
All right. Well, it's just 2 o'clock now, so.
Yeah. Still joining.
Starting to leave.
No, the number's going up.
That's always a positive sign.
No, it's like the COVID number. You don't want to see, you don't
They haven't shut us off yet. Okay. Should I give it one more minute? The number's still going up, so.
What's it at?
You should tell people
What number is it at?
to go up, view
About
options.
140
5,000 what?
right now.
Do side by side.
100,000.
View options at the top.
View
Click on
options.
Side by side.
Okay, I'm going to let you tell me to say that.
The PowerPoint.
Wait here. Okay. All right, we seem to be, the number's slowing down. Okay, I think we can start because I don't see the number. Well, I do see it going up occasionally, but not
People
this
coming late.
Yeah, so people can join us. Hi, everyone. I'm Janet Aronson, along with Mark Einhorn and Richard Brooks, and welcome to MEEB's first Zoom webinar. We don't know what we're doing, so I apologize in advance for any technical glitches, okay? So just bear with us, but we hope to have an informative discussion today about handling a unit owner meeting during the COVID-19 pandemic. A couple of technical things. What is it, Dina?
Under view options, pick side by side.
Okay, if you've joined us, it would be beneficial if you choose view options and pick side by side as the way to view this webinar. That way you'll be able to see the PowerPoint and all three of us at the same time. The other format issue is that Richard, Mark, and myself will make a brief presentation, and then we will try to take as many questions as possible when we're done presenting. So feel free, there's a question and answers button at the top, although it may be someplace different on your computer, but you can click on that and type in a question at any time, and then when we get to the end, we will try to answer as many questions as possible. So with that, I am going to turn it over to the esteemed Richard Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You can hold your applause to the end. Janet, you're not smiling. Can't you hear it?
No.
If the crowd is going wild.
First technical problem is Richard's first joke that did not go over well.
Those are people cheering and jumping up and down. Thank
Okay,
you very much.
happy
I
to see
started
it.
out all day, but enough people that hear.
All right,
Okay,
That
sorry.
didn't-
That's also my last joke. So,
okay, good.
so the first, oh, it's going off again. The first question is, should you hold your annual meeting now? So fortunately, COVID hit us early in the year, so you have plenty of time still in 2020 to call your meeting, so it's not like you missed your annual meeting in 2020. So right now in Massachusetts, you're allowed to have a crowd size inside of 10 people. In Rhode Island, it's 15. In New Hampshire, there is no limit. But with everything COVID, you need to be careful. And with everything in this world right now, you have to be careful. Things change on a moment's notice. So the one thing we're learning is change is constant. So be careful to change to check on the annual meeting size before you call your meeting. So if you're a small association, you're in good shape in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, because if you're really small, you can just have your meeting as normal. But if you're not, you have to deal with other things. So the first thing you need to always remember is the condominium documents are the Bible. So you need to see what they provide every time. They will tell you if there is a set date for the meeting, because there's not always a set date. If there is not a set date, then it's going to be easy to deal with, because you can have the date later on in the year. There's no particular date. Even if you always have it the same date, just change it this year till the pandemic's over, hopefully. Most documents will also say that you can have a special meeting in lieu of the annual meeting. So if it says that, your documents have already really provided for this, not obviously for a pandemic, but they've already dealt with the issue. And you can have the meeting, just call a special meeting later in the year. Your documents tell you everything. They tell you the number of days of notice before you have a meeting. They'll tell you your quorum requirements. They'll tell you if proxies are allowed or what type of document you need if you're not going to show up at a meeting. The documents provide all the rules that need to be followed. The question now is, does COVID change the rules? Does it change what you have to do? Can boards do what they want because there's a pandemic now? No. I mean, people ask us a lot of questions about that, and my answer is, well, it's COVID, maybe things can change. But you can't always just use the COVID excuse, because you have, Janet likes to do that, the COVID excuse, because you need to follow your documents. So you've got to think about the fact that there's still a rule of law. And I think our state and federal government deals with this daily, is what's the law? Does the Constitution change? Is an emergency? Is the world changed because there's COVID? And it has, but boards still need to be cautious. They're still bound by the law, but they can also act reasonably to try and deal with what the documents say, what's reasonable, what can you do under the law. You have to remember that you're going to be judged on all of this after the pandemic's over. People are going to look back and think differently because it's not the middle of the emergency anymore. And you could be doing things that may seem absolutely crazy, but they might not seem crazy now because you're in the middle of a pandemic. So think about how people are going to judge you later on, and because they're going to have more time to evaluate what you did to see if what you did really makes a lot of sense. Okay, the worst case scenario is going to be that your condo docs specifically state that your meeting is going to be on July, well, the worst case scenario is July 4th, and Janet has to go, because that seems to happen every year.
I've done that before.
Her
But
favorite
the worst
time.
case scenario is it's July, and you have to have the meeting, and it doesn't give you any other option. So what do you think you do? Well, if you're in Massachusetts and you have more than 10 people, you're not going to call the meeting because you have COVID as an excuse. So our office would say it's reasonable to change the date based on the law and based on the situation. But what if you can't wait because there's an important decision you have to take care of? Well, let's think about this. We're talking about, Mark's going to cover board meetings, I think, a little bit, but we're talking about unit owner meetings. The almost only this, well, different in other states, but in Massachusetts, the most important decision and the only decision boards make, unit owners make at a unit owner meeting is to elect the board. So what would happen if you couldn't have that meeting and you couldn't then have the election? Well, you wouldn't have the election yet, right? So what's the big deal? Well, most documents state that the most, not all, so you have to look, you always look at the documents, will state that the board will serve until the next annual meeting or until the successor to the board members are elected. So that kind of gets you out of it. You can postpone your annual meeting, wait, and you won't have a problem because your board will stay in power. When we draft certificates of election, we actually put that right in the document, so it's kind of clear. It doesn't overrule the documents. It kind of makes it clear that you stay in power till the next meeting that actually occurs. But you need to, again, look at your documents to see what they say and what you can reasonably do. You don't want to have a question as to the validity of your board if you have any major decision you're about to make. So don't go and decide to spend $5 million on a rehab with a board that might not have been properly elected, beside the fact that you might not want to spend that much money in the middle of COVID. But it's a bad time to make any important decisions. If you have to do it and the board has to make a decision, think about having the board confirmed at a future meeting and or have the board confirm any of their decisions at a future meeting. But really try to avoid any major decisions, okay? You have to be creative and think outside the box. Look at the documents, but think outside the box. COVID is forcing us to do that all over the place. It's how we eat, how we breathe, how we speak to our friends, how we have Thanksgiving, how we all had Easter. We all had to deal with it differently. So think about that when you're looking at your documents and speak to your attorneys and your managers, because there's probably ways to get around what your documents say without exposing yourselves to any liability, because you do not want to have a legal challenge to what you do in the future. Now, lastly, I want to point out this, there was a corporate change which allows, if you happen to have a corporate structure for your condominium, which is pretty rare, most of you out there have trusts. But if you happen to have a corporation, they changed the corporate law temporarily to allow remote meetings automatically without doing anything. But that's just if you happen to have a corporation. We've had that question a few times. Okay, well, now I'd like to turn this back over to the lovely Janet Aronson.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, I am going to talk for a few minutes about the alternatives to accomplish either a valid meeting or a valid vote. As Richard discussed, typically in the context of your condominium documents and most condominium documents, the only way that you can accomplish a valid vote is either through in-person attendance or by proxy. So some associations have just sent out what's called a mail-in ballot and had people send them back. That is not compliant with your condominium documents if your documents require voting to take place at a meeting, either in person or through a proxy. So that will not work. So one way, and this is actually kind of a simple approach, but right now we have the benefit of having beautiful weather. So many associations, or at least a number of them, have considered holding their annual meeting outside. Because as you know, in Massachusetts, the limit of 10 is only for confined spaces. So an outdoor meeting is fine to host, as long as that you can have people be socially distant, you can require masks, and you can actually accomplish your annual meeting. In fact, some communities, some municipalities have actually held their town meetings in this structure. At least one town that I'm aware of held their town meeting at the high school track, and they were able to have 550 attendees. So it is possible. They used a microphone, they did some very basic, very practical things, and they were able to accomplish the vote on 47 warrants. So for your association, again, as Richard noted, probably the only decision that you need to make is the election of board members. So you would have to accomplish one vote. So you want to make sure that you still follow all of the requirements of the documents, including making sure that there's a quorum in attendance. So you need to be able to check people in. You can have them sign in, maybe suggest they bring their own pens so that there's not a sharing of pens. Have hand sanitizer there, let them bring their own chairs. Effectively, you would be accomplishing the annual meeting in accordance with your condominium documents, and you can pass out ballots for the election, or you can do it through a show of hands.
Can I interrupt for 1 sec? Mark, you need to change the slide.
That's
Uh,
me.
That's
I'm
Janet.
not good at this. I already apologized in advance. I'm supposed to do the slides. Totally forget. Okay, so that's the outdoor meeting. Okay, now another approach to accomplish at least just the valid vote is to have an official meeting for a limited purpose only, okay? So if you wanted to accomplish an election in accordance with your condominium documents, you would still call an actual meeting. You would determine the date and the time, and you would send out notice in accordance with the requirements of your documents, whether it's 14 days or 10 days, or some documents it's no less than 30 days. So you would still follow those requirements, and you would establish that there will be an annual meeting on this particular date for the limited purpose. The annual meeting notice would indicate that there will be no in-person attendance. So voting is going to take place via a proxy, which would effectively be a mail-in ballot. And I have had a number of associations that have accomplished valid elections using this process. So what you have to think about is, okay, we've got to determine who the candidates are going to be in advance of the meeting. So you would send out a notice in advance saying that if you're interested in serving on the board, you need to declare your candidacy, perhaps submit a bio, a one-page bio, and submit that by a deadline to the property manager or to one of the board members. And then once the candidates are determined, you can then send out the mail-in ballot, which will actually be a proxy that will give the voting authority on behalf of that unit as the unit owners have determined. So they will actually cast their vote, and the person that is the proxy holder will do the formal cast for them. So what we suggest is that it either be the board president, if that person is not running, or the board secretary, or it could even be the property manager. In one case, I'm actually doing it for an association, and I am going to be the proxy as the attorney because they felt that they didn't want any of the unit owners to feel uncomfortable about submitting their ballots. So the ballots are being submitted back to me. You still need to have a quorum at that meeting. So we need to get enough proxies back that would establish a quorum. And as long as you get the quorum, then you can accomplish the vote. Now, sometimes not everybody returns their proxies or their ballots, and we don't achieve a quorum. So what you can do in that case is you can continue that meeting to a further date, maybe 20 days, 30 days, to allow yourself to contact those owners who didn't submit to submit their ballot at that time. So that ballot / proxy will add to the quorum, and hopefully you will achieve the meeting for just that limited purpose to accomplish the vote. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is that if you're taking it, the election is fairly straightforward. I mean, you can even do an interim Zoom meeting where the candidates can discuss, you know, who they are, what they envision for the association. But it does become more difficult if you have a more complicated vote that you want to present to the owners. And so I would be more careful if I was trying to accomplish a different type of vote. For instance, if you were trying to accomplish a vote to amend the documents and your documents specifically required it be done at a meeting, that is a more challenging topic to present to the unit owners without really having a good give and take. So I would just caution you in that regard. The other approach, yes?
If you didn't get a quorum, like in regular old days, most documents would still say that the board could appoint.
Yes, I was just about to get into that. Well, but I think if you're going to try to have an election, you should probably go forward and continue the meeting. But some documents, and you have to review your documents, will allow the remaining members of the board to be able to make an appointment. So if your documents permit that, one other alternative that you could consider is to do an informational ballot. Identify the 3 candidates, for instance, and let everyone submit a mail-in ballot. And then based on the outcome of that mail-in ballot, the board can make an appointment. So you need to look at your documents. You need to make sure that you have remaining board members that can actually still serve on the board, that can make the appointment, but that is one way around it. I've also had associations where they've only gotten 2 candidates for 2 open seats, so they didn't want to go through this whole proxy mail-in ballot process. And as long as their documents permit the board to make an appointment, once they determined that there were only 2 candidates for the 2 open seats, they were then able to make the appointment. So that's just another way, and it's a possibility under most condominium documents that the board or the remaining board members have the right to make an appointment. Now, some associations really want to accomplish, well, we want to make all these presentations to the owners. We want to give them information. We don't really want to wait much longer. If you had your annual meeting, or were supposed to have your annual meeting in the spring, it's now almost July and you still haven't presented this information to the owners. So we've suggested to hold an informational meeting in that case. And what that would allow you to do is, if you have an association that's 100 units, you could do it on Zoom, okay? Similar to what we're doing here today. But you don't need to see who's attending the meeting. You don't need a quorum because it's strictly an informational meeting. There are no attendance requirements. There's also no challenge to try to determine who is on that Zoom meeting in order to determine who's in attendance. So it's an easy way to make presentations. Similar to what we're doing here today. Make your presentation, email information to the owners, perhaps give them a packet in advance so that they can review it. I've had other associations where they're simply just mailing out the information this year and they're not doing any kind of annual meeting other than the limited meeting to accomplish the election. And certainly if you do a Zoom meeting, do try to have a process that unit owners can ask questions. I mean, unit owner meetings are really the one opportunity that most unit owners have to ask questions and make suggestions about the association. And if you don't have the give and take, and there is a way, I understand, on Zoom, even though I'm not familiar with it, that you can allow people to speak, raise their hand and speak and then ask their questions. So there can be more of a give and take. The last aspect of what I wanted to share with you is, well, what do you do, and this has happened, what do you do when you receive the petition of the unit owners to call a special meeting? And this has actually happened in the middle of a pandemic. Unit owners have wanted to call special meetings. And that is tricky because, as we already discussed, we have all of these limits on the number of people that we can actually have in attendance at a meeting. So you may have to consider what the topic of that special meeting would be. Perhaps if it's about doing a project or going forward with the project, maybe as the board, you slow that project down so that you can wait until it's safe to hold this type of meeting. I mean, you can try to do it as a Zoom meeting to make a presentation, but I think if you don't have the give and take and you don't comply with the requirements of the documents, that special meeting will not really be valid. So are you doing something, Richard?
Trying to read all the questions.
Oh.
Sorry.
Okay.
Actually, since you brought
I
up
thought
the
you were
question-
raising your hand, so I didn't know what was going on. Do
you
you
brought-
have a question?
Since you
Okay.
brought up questions, just everyone keep sending the questions and we're going to address those after.
I think we should, I think we should address them after. I don't know. I thought that's what we were going to do, but being flexible.
There's about 8 questions so far.
Yeah.
Okay. So I really just wanted to emphasize that what it is that you are doing to accomplish the vote or the unit owners meeting should be compliant with your documents. Because I have seen a couple of attempts where they're not compliant, and that jeopardizes not only the validity of what it is you're deciding, but as Richard indicated, well, maybe decisions down the road could be challenged because they may say, well, you were really never elected properly. So why leave any questions open in that regard? I would just simply do it compliant with the documents. And we do have enough workarounds that we should be able to assist you in getting either a valid meeting or a valid vote.
One last point on not being validly elected, because we
Yes.
don't talk about that during the pandemic, but we talk about it other times. If you're not validly elected, and you do something that's not correct, I wouldn't, and it ends up in a lawsuit and you get sued. I guess I've never seen it, but I could see a D&O carrier denying coverage saying, well, you weren't even a board member because the election was, you were never elected, so what were you doing? So I've never seen it, we've talked about it, but that'll be another reason you never want to be acting as a board member without making sure the election was proper.
Thank
That's a
you.
good point.
Okay, Mark, I believe that's
All right.
you. And I actually changed the
Wow.
slide.
Thanks, Janet.
Yes,
Way to go.
only took me 3 times.
Well, you got it right, so it's good. So as we all kind of emerge from the shutdown and the lockdown, a lot of businesses and organizations are kind of rethinking how they communicate, interact. And I think a lot of them have found that meeting remotely, having employees work remotely has been equally or even more productive than, say, everyone trudging to the office. Our firm, for example, is much more comfortable now using Zoom, but don't judge us by this. The rest of the office knows how to use it pretty well. We've been meeting with clients regularly, pretty much, at least once a day. On my case, I know Janet and Richard are doing the same. And in terms of scheduling and time saved, it's really been helpful. We've gotten a lot of feedback from it. And I think with as the trend continues, that more millennials integrate into the workforce, and they don't want to meet. They definitely do not want to meet. We joke around in the office that some of our younger colleagues will see them at the coffee maker, and then 2 seconds later they're with their iPhone emailing a question rather than just asking the question right then. So we always kind of thought that was funny, but maybe they're onto something. And they're all, this is the largest generation, so they're the ones buying most of the units, or will be soon, which means that associations are going to have to change. And this is one way. Even pre-COVID, we had clients express concerns about getting quorum, concerns about getting even candidates that want to run for the board. One of the most common questions is, well, how often does the board meet? Which is kind of the dreadful question. How many times do I have to go somewhere, or how am I going to fit it in my schedule? People are just beyond busy right now. Work doesn't stop at home. Some people are homeschooling or have been homeschooling. I had that privilege and working at the same time, along with my wife, who did most of it. But it hasn't been easy, and it may not get easier. So certainly the work and home line is blurry, and it offers flexibility, and that's what people really want right now. I would say the time to start looking at whether remote meetings and mail-in ballots and changes for your community is now. It's on everybody's mind. 60 Minutes did a segment last night about the national election, saying, asking the questions of whether they use mail-in ballots. They already use absentee ballots, but whether they should go have mass numbers of people doing mail-in ballots. So it's a good time to explore. You have to sometimes change. And even if your community, is made up of older people who maybe all are retired and they may want to still meet and socialize, it's still a good thing to look at in terms of amending, because changes are coming. We keep hearing about drones and self-driving cars. I have a few clients now who are doing full document reviews and kind of complicated amendments. So as a first step, we're going to adopt this type of amendment rather than have owners have to vote on all those amendments at a meeting later. We're going to first adopt this, which is an amendment that would allow people to mail in their consents, not have maybe do informational meetings as a first step. Because it's hard, as you know, to get unit owners to agree. 51, 67, and 75% unit owners.
That would be me. I don't know what I did. I should have touched anything.
You started doing your emails.
I didn't mean all of us.
How do I go back?
That's okay. I'll just keep talking about it.
Okay, you keep going, Mark. I'll figure it out.
So for some of you who haven't been involved in the amendment process, it typically, your documents will always have a section that say amendments, and it describes how to do it. Our amendment the one that we've been drafting for clients, changes what the requirements are to amend the documents. So for instance, many documents will say unit owners what we would say is you can vote by mail-in ballot. So you can still do the paper copy, mail it in with the postage. It'll get there in 3 weeks. Or you can vote electronically and allow virtual meetings using technology like Zoom or GoToMeeting. But as I was saying before, there are a lot of associations that still want to meet in person. We're in New England. I know that town meeting is kind of a social aspect to it throughout New England, and the annual meeting might be the only opportunity that unit owners and neighbors meet each other and talk. So what we've been doing is not saying never meet in person, amend it out, you'll never have to deal with it again. We're trying to give boards flexibility. And the idea is to really do that so you can maximize unit owner participation. But involving owners in the beginning definitely is the way to go. I have a few boards that spend hours debating about, should they implement no smoking or limit rental units, but they've never asked the owners what they want. So at the end of the process, the majority of owners say, wait, we don't want this. Or if we do want it, we think you should have implemented it a different way. So I would test the waters. You can hold some informational Zoom meetings, see who attends, see if you get a nasty gram saying, I had no access, why would you do this? Or if it's positive. So, and mostly, you could also do by survey. So one good way of getting feedback quickly is to either use email or set up a survey that people can log on the website and give feedback about what they want to see in the future. Got the slide back, that's good.
Yes. I'm afraid to touch anything else though.
Yeah, I don't think you should.
Okay.
So the idea with the amendment is, again, to recap, is not to say we'll never meet in person again, but to allow the board to have flexibility. Some issues are going to be complex, and you might want to do mail-in ballots, and some you might want to meet in person. The mechanics of the amendment are really baked in, as I was saying earlier, into the condominium documents. Richard mentioned how important it is to make sure the board is duly elected or duly appointed. For this type of amendment, when you're adopting it, you're basically setting the foundation for all future elections. You're also setting the foundation for all future amendments. So it really is imperative that when you do the amendment and go through the amendment process, you follow what the requirements are. I'll give you an example. So some bylaws might say to amend the bylaws requires unit owners holding 51% in interest by vote at a valid meeting. It's not okay then to set up a process where owners are just sending in mail-in ballots. Janet talked about the formalities of the meeting. You'd have to put this, you'd have to have quorum. And when it says vote at a valid meeting, that really does mean owners have to be at the meeting to vote in person or use a proxy. So mail ballots or even signing a petition, you can even have, and there's some cases on this, 100% consent, but they didn't follow the process. And you don't want to go through all this trouble and then have someone challenge the amendment. So follow the documents. It is a little tedious, but you'll get a better result. In some cases, the condominium documents will require mortgage holder consent, which does add some complexity to the amendment process, but it can be done. It's easier now in Massachusetts. The condominium statute was amended a few years ago to allow mortgage holder consent to be deemed given if they don't respond in 60 days. And also a lot of the condominium documents actually have that provision when they require mortgage holder consent. Once you have all your consents and you have either determined mortgage holder consent's not needed, you would sign, the board, at least the majority of the board would sign the amendment, and that amendment would be filed at the appropriate registry of deeds. And that would stand as record notice to present owners, but also future owners, that these provisions exist, and they'll be in the chain of title of the condominium. I know a lot of you, although Richard touched on it in the beginning, I know a lot of you are probably thinking about board meetings, not just unit owner meetings, and probably, oh, what are we going to do? We have some big decisions to make. The good news is that in most cases, board meetings can be held remotely. You have to review your documents, but typically decisions made outside of a meeting, so long as the trustees or board members agree, are valid. And usually there's provisions that say that in the condominium documents. Likewise, unlike unit owner meetings, which typically have provisions in the condominium documents that require owners to cast their vote in person or by proxy, typically it's silent about that for board members. In a virtual meeting where trustees can interact and ask questions, there's a strong case to make that that is actually a valid meeting, whether or not the documents actually state that or not. Still,
I do want to jump in on that because I totally agree with you on that point. I mean, it is different for board members. It's a smaller group of individuals and they are able to have a give and take. And I know many board members have been meeting via Zoom. And I think that that is as valid as an in-person meeting. It's the same give and take. And I do not see any court really objecting to that ever.
Yeah, I agree. But even still, if I would say recommend as a best practice that the board adopt a resolution stating that virtual meetings are in fact a meeting. Try to take away the question. And
well,
also,
and I think including it at the time of if you are going to go through the amendment process, why not include it? So then there's no question. But
yeah, I agree. Oh, definitely, we would definitely include it in the amendment that we would draft for clients. But I'm talking about right now at boards, if they're wondering, they can still adopt a resolution saying that we're going to meet virtually as a board, but that is going to constitute a valid meeting. And again, if you're worried about it or you have a large, big decision, important decision coming up, the board can always ratify that decision or reaffirm that decision at a later meeting. And it's a good it's a good practice to do that if you're concerned. How are we doing on time?
we're doing okay. I don't know if you want to just try to take some of the questions.
Yeah, I see there's 23 questions, so I think we should maybe.
Some may be comments, I heard.
Some comments.
Yeah, there were a few about Janet.
Sorry about that. I'm
Okay.
afraid to touch the questions because that's when I lost the screen.
This is a good question.
Okay.
What if it's a transition meeting from the developer to the owner-controlled board, and the operating event has already occurred? So in other words, the developer really is holding over, and we need to transfer to the unit owners. Anyone, you want to?
Well, my first comment would be accomplish that as soon as you can, no matter how you can do it, because you always want the developer control to be turned over to the board. A lot of owners, when they call us, think, oh, we don't want to get involved because the developer hasn't finished things, or we want to go after that guy. But you don't have any powers until you're the board. So you want to get in charge of the place as soon as you can. So I guess it's going to go back to one of the ways you would do it. You call a meeting and have somebody be there and have maybe power of attorney, limited power of attorney proxies sent out so you can accomplish the quorum and get it turned over.
Yeah, and Janet, that was one of the options that Janet talked about, where you could use directed proxies just for that purpose. So you'd schedule the meeting, people would send in directed proxies, and no one would actually attend in person.
Correct. And just along the same lines, it's not in connection with the transition meeting, but just to reiterate, because somebody did text over a question and they wanted to understand, well, if it's an annual meeting and it's called strictly for the limited purpose of the election, how does that comply with the documents? And the reason why that would comply with the condominium documents is that you are officially calling an actual meeting. It's just the attendance will only be through a proxy. So that's the only topic, that's the only purpose for the meeting. Remember, when you give notice of a meeting, you're supposed to include all of the purposes for that specific meeting. So for this particular meeting that you're only handling the election, that would be the only express purpose for that meeting. So it would still be compliant.
Right.
Thanks.
Next question is, can a board simply not have a meeting this year due to the extraordinary circumstances, i.e. we're in a pandemic? I think we're lost. Richard, your audio is off. So, Jen, I'll just build that.
Okay.
Well, Richard is,
I mean,
he's-
I certainly think that at this juncture, it's not particularly safe to hold an annual meeting, you know, the traditional annual meeting that we're all used to. So I think it can still be postponed. My concern is where we're going in the future. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in 2 months. We may not, things may not get better.
Right.
As we're seeing across the country, we're seeing sort of a shift back. So if you have business that you have to conduct, like a vote for board members, then I think you at some point really need to have that meeting. I mean, you can postpone it for a time, but at some point you have to recognize that you need to have this election, so you can't continue to postpone. If you don't have an election or anything for the unit owners to vote on, I suppose then there's less harm in not holding the annual meeting, but I would still recommend that you at least provide some basic information to the owners so that they understand the state of the association, the finances, and you know what projects are being contemplated, all of the typical things that you would discuss at an annual meeting.
yeah, and also just to add quickly, if you have big decisions that have to be made, you don't want to keep delaying, you know, and you haven't had an election and the terms are technically up. You want to be careful of that too.
So do it now outside. I mean, really.
Right.
Right now, there's a window of opportunity.
Right. We are in that right now. And you can, even when you do it outside, you can select a rain date. So if you get a day like today, you can have at least 1 or 2 alternative rain dates so you can work around it.
Just, Janet, this question's for you. If the usual annual date has already expired, what do you call it? Do you call it a special meeting to clarify?
I would typically call it a special meeting in lieu of the annual meeting.
Me too.
Okay, if you did a mail-in informational ballot for appointment, should the mail-in ballots be notarized for, you know, to verify the owners? I would say no. I would think that's beyond, unless your documents require that. And, you know, I wouldn't include that in the amendment to allow mail-in ballots. I wouldn't require that each one be notarized. That's particularly burdensome.
Why don't they instead mail out ballots that are identified in another way, like color-coded with numbers on them so that you know that the person getting it is the person that signed it because they're the only ones that got that number, versus then it's easier than getting notarized. Especially with trying to get notaries to do anything nowadays is not
right. And I agree with that. You don't, and you want to limit people having contact with other people. So you would want to limit people having to have their signatures notarized, because that implies that they are in front of somebody else or within, well, there is a remote notarization, but it seems.
I was just going to say that is, but it's not easy to do. Yeah, it is kind of complicated. In fact, I'd choose not to do that. Can you
close the window?
Can you conduct an actual annual meeting on Zoom? And what would be the process to verify attendees if you did? I think you could. And as you know, Jen, as you mentioned, there is a way to count or log in people who join the meeting. Asking questions, as I was thinking about this for a client recently, you could have them do questions like the attendees are now doing, and those will be addressed at the end. Or you could even do a separate email address for people to email questions. It's possible to do. I think when you get a lot of people though, and you're trying to communicate, it's difficult.
I don't know what happened to Richard, but whatever, go ahead.
yeah.
Keep going.
The only thing I can say is at least he's wearing pants, so that
Yes,
was
I know. I was nervous about that. I don't know. I'm guessing that's the bathroom behind him, but just a guess, but keep going. Somebody raised their hand. I don't really know how to do that. Is that me? Do I do something with that?
So a question, and I think we answered this, but just in case, can regular trustee board meetings be held via Zoom, and are they legal? Do our documents need to be revised for that? Typically, that would constitute a valid meeting, and typically you don't have to revise the documents. Question regarding mail-in ballots. If you want to do a remote annual meeting with mail-in ballots, do you have to amend the documents? What if you don't? Are elections valid?
Well, that was the process that I discussed, the alternative process, which is you still need to have compliance with the condominium documents, and that requires a meeting that's attended either in person or through proxy. So you could do a remote meeting, but the attendance has to, well, I guess if you can accomplish your voting, you're able to effectively sign people into the meeting remotely and allow them to vote remotely, then you're saying they're in attendance at that meeting. But the backdrop to that would be to simply use a mail-in ballot / directed proxy and allow them to vote that way, and then you have actual compliance. And just so that everybody understands, when we say mail-in ballot, it doesn't have to be mailed back to the association. You could have it emailed back to the association. So it's not as though it can't be done electronically. It's just that would be the process that you establish to return the proxy.
This is an interesting question. So if the board does remote meetings, but typically has open meetings for unit owners, how can owners participate? Or can that just be a closed meeting? Well, one way is, you could allow them to join the meeting as a participant if you're using Zoom. If you don't want to do that for the entire meeting, if you're doing like an executive session, you could have a call-in number and have some kind of speakerphone, or then share an invite to the meeting depending on what technology you're using.
You can also do 2 Zoom meetings back to back,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just end one and start another one.
That's true.
Right. If the condo bylaws say the trustees shall submit reports of the management and finances of the condominium at the annual meeting, can those reports still be done at an informational meeting or by mail if no in-person annual meeting is held?
I would say yes.
I say yes. What else are you going to do?
Right. We're in a pandemic. Nothing
It's
is
the COVID exception.
Yes.
COVID exception.
Yes. I don't think a court would say that you didn't comply. And what would be the harm? I mean, you gave the information, which is what I was saying earlier. To not have a meeting at all or not present the typical information probably doesn't make sense. You should at least attempt to accomplish it in some manner, whether you do a Zoom meeting, whether you mail the information out to all the owners or email it to all of the owners. So I think it is important to share the information with the owners.
We have a question about New Hampshire.
Okay.
Are Zoom meetings acceptable for open meetings, as we are required to hold 4 open meetings a year?
I would say yes. And also in New Hampshire, just so that everybody is aware, you do have the right already to conduct unit owner votes via mail or electronically. The statute does indicate that you can allow for unit owner meetings to be held remotely, but your documents have to allow that. So you would need, if your documents didn't specify that, you would need the amendment that Mark was discussing to validate remote unit owner meetings.
This question goes to the point I was making about it's getting hard to sometimes find candidates to run as trustees. This is a board member who is the sole remaining trustee. Do they have to keep going as trustee? So, um,
They
anyone?
should until they can find somebody else.
Yeah.
You're gonna have a lot of problems like 60 certificates, bank accounts, guy buying insurance. They just have to beg someone else to do it.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
or pay them, or bribe them, or do whatever you have to do.
Yeah.
Or sell your unit.
Yeah. So what happens if a management or manager has valid health concerns and the property or the board is demanding at this point face-to-face meetings, even though technically it won't be a large group? I think this is from a manager.
Okay. Well, I think it's reasonable to have concerns given what we know about the illness. And I mean, obviously the relationship between the manager and the board is an important one. I'd like to think that they could be on the same page and be understanding, you know, during this particular time. I mean, perhaps the manager can attend via Zoom, or I don't know if there's a way to handle the meeting, you know, socially distant and wearing masks. I would think that that might be an alternative.
Or the manager could call in on a conference call while the rest of the board meets at the property.
Right.
There was a manager who was at a meeting that I know of, where someone had COVID at the meeting and another board member contracted it and passed away. So it's a very valid, obviously it's a very valid concern right now, but so call in, have the manager call.
It is. I mean, not, as you guys know, I'm not tech savvy, but FaceTime is actually a great thing. You know, you can explain, hey, what does it look like? You hold up the phone, you can see what it is you're talking about. So that's another option. What about a hybrid? Can we have an in-person meeting with limited number and then supplement by a Zoom meeting at the same time to accommodate more people?
That's a little bit more difficult because, so are you suggesting two separate meetings? One's in person and then the other one is after? Or are you saying at the same time, you are allowing in-person attendance and also attendance via Zoom, which I guess would have to be on a screen, I think, at that location.
Yeah, I think the question is at the same time. You know,
at the same time. Yeah, I don't know how you would accomplish it, but because the people who are in attendance need to participate with the people who are on Zoom. So I don't know how you would mesh those two. I did have an association that's larger, and they initially contemplated having 2 annual meetings, mostly for informational purposes, because they were trying to accommodate the number of people who would attend and allow them to be socially distant. And it didn't work. So they did end up going with the Zoom meeting, and everybody attended via Zoom. And I understand it went very well, but it was only for informational purposes. They used a directed proxy mail-in ballot for the election.
Okay, thanks. We believe that a resident has contracted COVID-19. Should we tell the rest of the building?
That sounds more like our regular day question.
Different question.
Well, it's related, so.
Yeah, we all say yes, but don't disclose the person's name.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
if you have a reasonable basis to believe it. I mean, I wouldn't do it on speculation.
Right. I mean, but I think from the tone of the question, it sounds like they know. If you know,
They know.
you want to let residents know. Don't identify the unit number or the name, but at least if you tell people in the building, they can take either more precautions or plan, differently.
And the board should then take more precautions too, because now they know the infections in the building with cleaning and everything else. So I think you should tell them, not just think about it. Like, I don't know either way. I wouldn't do it affirmatively. Definitely tell everybody, because if somebody then died in the building and the board knew that somebody had it in the building and didn't tell the rest of the building, wouldn't a lawyer try and make an argument that you then maybe were involved in the death because you didn't tell the rest of the building that somebody had it? So what's the benefit of not telling everybody?
Yeah, why risk it?
Right, and it's somewhat related to that, but even when you're holding your unit owner meetings, you want to make sure it's done safely. I mean, you don't want to be exposing the association to any liability if somebody attends the meeting and has COVID or tests positive for COVID. So you do want to make sure that this isn't, we need to be careful about how we hold the meeting so that we don't put ourselves in any further position of any potential liability, which is why the processes, the alternative processes that we're talking about, or amending the documents to actually have these alternatives in your documents, makes sense.
Richard, this probably is going to be for you. I believe Massachusetts addresses special allowances due to COVID regarding meetings. So if it's okay for the state, with the state, isn't it okay for virtual board meetings, and wouldn't that be legal? So
That's what we'd argue if you wanted to do it and we had to defend you. We just say it's an analogy because the state thought about this and passed an emergency law for corporations or for municipalities. That would be an argument. But as usual, condos were forgotten in the process. We get forgotten all the time. Laws get passed. Oh God, there's condos out there. How do we forget that? So that would be the argument. It probably would seem pretty reasonable to a judge. We did what everybody else in the state did, all the corporations did. But again, it's better to amend your documents because that's the Bible. That's what you're supposed to live by.
next question I think I'm going to take, it's about amending documents. What is the process in Massachusetts to amend condominium documents to allow for remote meetings? The process really is not statewide or statute driven. The documents will specify what the requirements are, and typically it's either the unit owner consent or possibly a vote at a meeting or written signatures, and then we'll specify what percentage of unit owners have to vote or consent to the amendment, which could be 51, it could be 67%, it could be 75%, and again, you might need mortgage holder consent. So it really is document driven and not by state law. And Rhode Island and New Hampshire are similar too.
Mark, it's 5, so you know.
But we're okay, 5 minutes. I've got a few questions left. Do the virtual meeting resolutions get approved by the board, and does it require approval of the unit owners?
The minutes?
No,
it's
the
through
resolution.
resolution. So typically, no, the board would adopt the resolution for board meetings, and typically that wouldn't require unit owner consent to do. You'd have a majority of the board adopting it, or ideally 100% of the board adopting it. This one's kind of long, so I'm skimming it. Looks like Rhode Island. I'll just start reading. Our annual meeting was originally scheduled for May. At that point, our state, Rhode Island, was pretty much locked down. Stay at home. The board, who was elected prior, is still serving and following through with our responsibilities. We have one owner who is hell-bent on having a meeting to vote in a new board. Of course, he's running. Our community is mostly older. We, the board, have been waiting for guidance from the government, and the restrictions are enormous. How do we proceed from here? No one will attend outside meeting. No one wants to be in an inside meeting. Our docs specifically state the time for the annual meeting. We need your help. Love those questions.
Okay, I can answer that.
All right.
I mean, I think given the current situation, you're still okay to be continuing that meeting and holding off. What you're saying is no one's going to attend your meeting, so even if you called it, you won't have a quorum and no official business can even be transacted. So the suggestion would be to continue to postpone the meeting and give it some more time. I mean, this is either going to improve, hopefully, the situation, and you'll be able to ultimately have your meeting. And if it doesn't, then you may have to consider some alternative form of a meeting or in an alternative form of election, something along the lines as what I discussed earlier, where the meeting is called for that limited purpose. There's no in-person attendance. In Rhode Island, though, you do need to have your budget approved. So that's another vote that would have to take place at a meeting. I don't know if that's actually happened. If that doesn't take place, then the existing budget that was in effect for the previous year would remain in place and carry forward. So that's another perhaps reason or another purpose for the limited meeting that you would call.
Okay. A rarity in Massachusetts, this association is incorporated. And if they are, their question is, can they have a remote meeting without amending the document?
Yes. Believe it or not, yes. If you email us, I can send you, or Dan sent it to me this morning, a copy of the statutory change. It was probably about a month ago they changed it. And I believe it's also temporary. It's only as long as the emergency order is in place. So if you need to do it now, email over, we'll get you a copy of it.
Actually, I also wanted to, and I didn't get to do it in terms of this Zoom meeting, but if somebody is interested in the mail-in ballot / proxy form, I'm happy to give a sample of that out. If you email, I guess you would email Dina, that's the information that you have. dpepjanovich@meeb.com, and we can email you the sample.
And a few people have also asked if our slides would be available, which I assume that they will be.
They can be, yes.
Janet, you referenced mailing out annual meeting information to unit owners, but was that suggested to be acceptable in place of a meeting or only to prepare for one of the other types of meetings that you noted?
Okay, I think both, okay? I mean, if you're uncomfortable holding an annual meeting at this time, then it would just be, informational at this point until you can actually hold an annual meeting at a later date. You can also mail the information or email it and consider holding the Zoom informational type meeting where you actually discuss the contents of your financials and other reports of the association. So you can do that as an alternative. At least that will, provide owners the opportunity to ask questions, participate in the association, and give the board members a sense of where the owners are at on various issues.
Okay. There's one more just popped up. I was about to say this was the last new question, but question is, can an owner not live in his unit and still serve on the board?
Depends what the documents say. Most of the time, it's fine. Almost all the time, it's fine. You still have to get elected. So people that live in the property are more likely to get elected because people point out that, oh, that person doesn't live here, so he probably doesn't, or she doesn't care about the place. But this very rarely is a requirement. You guys agree?
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. There's a couple more questions. I think we'll just take them.
Okay.
This question is about the Massachusetts state ruling on masks. In a complex of garden-style condominiums, the board has installed decals informing everyone of the mandatory use of masks. What is the board's responsibility or liability to enforce the governor's ruling? Well, first, if the association has basically adopted a rule by telling people to wear masks at the property, it is the governor's ruling, but it's also now a board rule and regulation.
The governor's rule, though, wouldn't apply to private property. You think? So it would be the board rule that would overrule.
Yeah,
it would be the board rule we're dealing with.
And I think if it's a board rule, while you don't want to be punitive, and certainly people are going to have to, retrain ourselves, all of us, not to handshake, to wear our masks, you could, and you probably should at some point, institute fines if it keeps happening I wouldn't do it the first violation, but some enforcement measures is I would recommend. You guys agree?
But what if they always
I
park
agree
in
with
the
that.
what if they always park in the tow zone and don't wear a mask? Then what do you do?
Well,
Because
then you told them while they're still in the car so that you don't have to worry about the mask. No, I agree with that, Mark. I think the board's duty is to adopt reasonable rules and regulations regarding the use of the common areas. And we have all heard all of the various reports, although they didn't start that way initially, that wearing masks not only may help the individual wearing it, but may also help slow the spread to others. So I think it's reasonable for the board to adopt that rule.
Okay. We have one more question, a little unrelated, but is it safe to open the pool yet? Probably a topic for another webinar, which is complex, but not Not without risk, I guess, is the short answer. And
Yeah, I'm saying, people are asking me, I said, there's a lot of risk, unfortunately. If you want the risk, be very careful how you open it. And a lot of people are not opening the pools this year. Plus, they get the added benefit of saving money, but there's risk involved. So the safer course is not to open it, but there's going to be pressure. It's a huge political issue right now inside the community.
it is. I mean, before you do that, or even a health club, definitely talk to the insurance agent and see if there'll be insurance if someone gets COVID, because it likely may not be. I think
And
that's
there's
all.
releases we want you to sign.
Mhm.
On this one, we're going to say call our office because it's not a simple answer at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Janet, I think
Okay.
that's about
I
all the
think that's
questions I
it.
have.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that we answered some of your questions regarding unit owner meetings and how to accomplish them in a valid way. Again, if you want a sample of that directed proxy mail-in ballot, please email dpepjonovich, that's at meeb.com. That would be who you reply to in connection with this webinar, and we will have a copy of that emailed to you. Good
Great.
luck, everyone. Stay safe. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye
One of you has to hit end the meeting button.
Yes, that would be me.
Okay.
As soon as I figure that out, we will be done. It might take a minute, though.
Top of the screen.
I'm staying as long as you will.
Okay, well, you can.
You still have 86 participants.
Yeah, I think you did it. I
Do
think
you
did
have
it.
any thoughts on what I might
That's the
press
screen.
to end the meeting? End. How about
Leave.
that? Okay. End meeting to all. Bye-bye.